evening, everybody, and thank you for coming to the Chicago Urban League. My name is Stephanie Schmitz-Bechtoller. I'm our Vice President of Research and Policy here at the Chicago Urban League, and we're delighted to be able to have this panel here in a discussion on rent control in Illinois. As you may hear, I'm a little bit getting over a cold, so I prepared some statements, which I'm going to have my colleague Kareem read, just to talk about the context of why we're having this discussion and really why we believe that rent control is an important and really very critical tool in affordable housing. It's one that we don't have available to us right now in Illinois. So this conversation hopefully will be very informative and very engaging and will help you learn a little bit more about this and why this is really critically important. So I'm going to hand this off to my colleague Kareem, and then he will welcome the panel and we'll begin the discussion.
Good evening, everyone. So my name is Kareem Butler. I am the 2020 Census Project Coordinator, and as Stephanie said, I'm just going to be going over, giving you guys some context as to why we're all here, as to why we're gathered here to discuss rent control and the issue of housing here in Illinois. So Illinois is one of a handful of U.S. states that is losing population, and the city of Chicago in particular is losing its African American population. This loss has been happening over the past several decades, but has recently been accelerating. So there are many factors involved in this outward migration, including the limited availability of jobs and quality educational seats in local schools. But we believe that a key driver of this population loss is the lack of quality, affordable housing units. I stress both quality and affordable. Cheap apartments can be found, but they are just that, cheap and often in disrepair. Good apartments can be found, but the rent becomes less and less affordable the higher the quality rises. We believe that the lack of affordable housing options, especially after the CHA plan for transformation and the subsequent lack of Section 8 vouchers, along with the gentrification of many parts of the city of Chicago, have resulted in a loss of African Americans living in both the state and the city. In order for people to live in a community, it must be affordable to the renter and their families. As Chicago's rents continue to rise, many African Americans are shut out of the rental market, instead looking to nearby suburbs or nearby states like Indiana or moving further south to places like Atlanta. Building new affordable housing units takes time and considerable resources. Converting existing buildings into a mix of market and below market rents can help, but also takes time and a lot of political will. And the enormity of the need is larger than these solutions. One option that we cannot even consider in Illinois is rent control. This is because there is a total statewide ban on municipalities and counties even considering this as a means of increasing affordable housing. We believe that each and every individual, family, and child deserves to live in safe, affordable, and stable neighborhoods. Lifting the ban would allow for more stability in neighborhoods, as families would not be scrambling time and time again to find an affordable place to live. Tonight, you will have an opportunity to learn more about rent control, what it is, what it does, and how it can be a workable solution for Illinois. I am delighted to hand the evening over to Jawanza Malone, Executive Director of the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization. In addition to all their other community work, he, his staff, and fellow housing advocates have been fighting for years to lift the ban in Illinois. I hope you find this evening informative and thought-provoking.
All right, thank you, Kareem. Let's give Kareem and Stephanie a round of applause for allowing us to be here. So, for us, this journey to understand how to save our communities from the scourge of displacement and how to stabilize and reclaim this idea of what a community actually is begins with an 85-year-old woman. In 2003, Antheus Capital, a private venture capital firm out of New Jersey, bought the building where the senior lived. She moved there in the early 1960s when she moved out of the Robert Taylor homes. She raised a family there, sent her children off to school to start their own lives and families, and that is the place that she has called home for 50 years now. When Antheus Capital bought the building, she immediately began to see rents increase. Every year when she went to renew her lease, the rent was going up and up and up. In 2016, the same year that it was announced the Obama Presidential Center would be built in Jackson Park, when she went to renew her lease, she was informed that her entire monthly fixed income would now have to go towards her rent. So you have this 85-year-old woman in a place that she's called home for 50 years, where she's raised her family, now has to make a decision if she's going to spend her entire monthly check on the first of the month, or if she's going to have some other option. She came to us to get support. Coco's organizers and leaders wrapped their arms around her, and we were able to help her get a rent reduction that was frozen for 2 years, but that's one person in one building. And so when you think about all the people who live in this community, all the people who live in the city, who are not just rent burdened, where they're paying more than 30% of their income on rent, or severely rent burdened, where they're paying upwards of 50% or more of their income on rent, but senior citizens who literally have to make the decision between paying their rent on time, in full, and having food for the rest of the month, being able to pay for their medication, maybe buying a toy for one of their grandkids. These are the choices that people are being faced with in the so-called private housing market. And so for us, it was, how do we create greater affordability, right? Kareem already said it, right? We're not going to build our way out of this problem. In Chicago alone, 182,000 units of affordable housing is needed. Right now, not in the future, today. When you look statewide, that number multiplies by 20. So 3.64 million apartments are needed. No mayor is going to build that. No governor is going to build that. No well-intentioned developer is just going to throw open the banks and build 3.64 million apartments for low-income and working families. So what alternative are we left with, right? We have an existing housing stock that is becoming either unaffordable or unlivable day by day. We have to figure out a way to regulate rent increases. And through regulating rent increases, we give people an opportunity to be able to pay what they can afford. And so our panel here is going to talk a little bit tonight about their understanding of why the ban on rent control needs to be lifted. And some will go further to talk more specifically about rent control as a tool that can be used to deal with the affordable housing crisis. But you also have been given index cards, or you will receive index cards if you have a question throughout the discussion. There's a few questions I have for the panelists, but at any point, I encourage you to write your question down, hand it to Kareem, and he'll get it to me so your question can be answered. Are we okay so far? Ready to get into it? Yeah? Yeah? All right. So we're going to start with Ms. Manya Taylor. So Ms. Taylor, can you just introduce yourself and talk about why this issue uniquely impacts you?
Hi, everybody. My name is Manya Taylor. I am a person with a disability, and I advocate for people with disabilities. Now, it affects me because I have a voucher because of my income. And a lot of people with disabilities, they don't have vouchers. And the income, the SSI income is about $774. And they're not able to afford rent, so a lot of them live in the streets. They live with other people and things like that. So I consider myself as one of the lucky ones, but maybe not so lucky, because my turn might come too, where I'm out in the streets. Because having a voucher is not a security blanket. You know, I can lose it at any time. And it has happened. You know, I did lose my voucher some years ago, but I fought to get it back, and I did get it back, but it's just really hard, and a lot of people don't get their vouchers back. So I wanted to talk about, I want to talk about, I don't want to talk about me, I want to talk about this story that I was given, and she's an advocate that works with me. So she became disabled during 9/11, and she started sleeping on people's couches, on and off, for 7 years, unable to move back to where she had lived in the Edgewater neighborhood. And that was because the rent had gone up so quickly that she finally secured a place downtown, and that was with the housing voucher. Now, at this risk of becoming homeless again, because CHA has to decide whether or not to pay for her rent because the rent has increased. And they have to make a decision whether they're going to pay her rent. And that their decision will decide whether she's back out into the streets again. And she's not the only one that tells stories like this. It's a lot of people, especially with disabilities, that live in the street, you know, or either they're put in nursing homes or shelters. And the reason why a lot of them are in the street because they would just rather die before they go into any of those institutions. So people with disabilities, you know, a lot of them end up dead, you know, because of homelessness. So it's just really bad for people with disabilities.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor. AK? Same question.
All right. Hey there, folks. My name is A.K. Alalanu. I'm a student organizer with the University of Chicago's chapter of Common Cause, Illinois. We've been working with the Lift the Ban Coalition for about 2 years. There are 2 reasons that I think we got to lift the ban. Number one is at the University of Chicago, there are a lot of low-income students, particularly low-income students of color, who've got to work out how to pay for food and their books and their supplies. At the same time, they're trying to balance 1, 2, 3 different kinds of part-time jobs while they're just trying to get an education. At the same time, their families are trying to put together enough money to afford what is on track to be one of the most expensive colleges in the country. And on top of all that, they got to figure out how much rent's going to cost next year. The second reason is, beyond the low-income students who are dealing with this kind of burden, Hyde Park is not a college town. The individuals who come to live and study in this community not only impact their neighborhood, but the communities around them. We are at least temporary residents of the city of Chicago, and the things that people do there do impact the rest of the city. And there's this overwhelming sense of guilt that these 17, 18-year-old students who just came to the university to study, they do not have control over the institution. They didn't buy the land. They did not segregate the housing. I was one of those students however many years ago, and there's this overwhelming sense of guilt because all these students universally know that just by being in this space, every day they're making it more difficult for the individuals who live and work in these communities, who send their kids to schools there, who run the small businesses, who clean the windows or work in the dining halls. Every day they make it more difficult for them to survive. And so we got to lift the ban because we got to do right by them.
Thanks, AK. Bill?
Jawanza, could you repeat the question?
Sure. Just really introduce yourself and talk about how rent burden or increase in rents impact you and the people you work with.
Okay. Well, my name is Bill Lamb, and I'm speaking on behalf of a group called UNITE, which is Spanish for Get United. And we are an organization in Little Village, which used to be called South Lawndale. It's like west to western over to the Cicero city line, and around Cermak and 26th Streets are some of the main streets through that neighborhood. So it's mainly ethnically Mexican, both immigrant and Mexican American citizens. in that neighborhood. So I'm not a typical looking person from Little Village. But my son is half Mexican, and my wife and I wanted to bring him up in a Mexican neighborhood so that he could be culturally familiar and with that identity of his. And we rented in Little Village for about 5 years, and then we bought a house in Little Village where we've been for over 30 years now. So for me, the most important thing about Little Village is it's a community of people with a culture and a way of life. It's a relatively stable neighborhood. People have been there a long time. People are sometimes there for generations, living on the same block or in the same neighborhood as their parents and as their children. This is all at risk now, as we believe we are on the chopping block for the next gentrified neighborhood. Not that we're the only one in that status, but that's happening. Pilsen to our east has been greatly transformed, and the rents have gone up considerably, and many people have had to move. And we don't want that to happen in Little Village, but it's starting. So we need a way to defend ourselves against people with a lot of money coming in and buying up properties and driving up the rent and forcing the people who live there to move out and bring in people with a lot more money and change the character of the neighborhood. So that's why we need, I think rent control represents our best form of self-defense, where we can have some say in the policies there, and people can continue to live there and pay their rents on the incomes they make, as you mentioned. We have to realize the incomes that people are making, and the rents have to be affordable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bill. Let's come back to Ms. Teller. Ms. Teller, as AK mentioned, this is a campaign that people have been working on for years now. Clearly, there's tough opposition. There are people who are saying we don't need rent control. We need to keep the ban on rent control in place. What would you say to the opponents opponents of lifting the ban on rent control or rent control as a tool?
Well, I would say that rent regulation puts a cap on the amount that landlords can request. Now, for leasing their property, rent regulation helps to protect people from displacement and gentrification, and just the fear of not knowing whether you're going to end up on the streets because of rent hikes. People with disabilities are most vulnerable. Only 1% of Chicago's housing stock is accessible, and most of those are in expensive buildings, unaffordable to people who receive $774 a month, which are people with disabilities. We often choose to rent in places we can barely afford, so when the rent goes up, we have nowhere to go. We even choose indecent and inaccessible dwellings. Homelessness has become so normalized that it is often overlooked.
Thank you. AK?
Here we go. We do support lifting the ban, and we do get opposition. One particular strain that the opposition always takes the form of is that we can't lift the ban because rent control is a bad idea, which I always think is interesting, how all of a sudden we want to ban things because we think they're bad ideas, because personally, I think mass incarceration is a terrible idea. And I've not yet to see a ban on that. I think that closing down our mental health centers, that's a bad idea. I think that shutting down our schools is a bad idea. I think gentrification is a very, very bad idea. But it's interesting that in this one situation, we are people who are trying to come together and combat gentrification, who want to uplift the black and brown communities in this part of the city. We can't have that because that's a bad idea. And I think that's dishonest and ridiculous, just because if this had been a bad idea, we wouldn't have been doing it in the first place. So that's all I have to say to that.
Bill, what would you say to the opposition?
What would I say to the opposition? Get out of my neighborhood. The pursuit of wealth should not take place at the disadvantage of people of modest means. People have a right to live with dignity and to be able to find a home and live in it, even if they can't afford to buy it. They should still be able to stay there, raise their children there. These are things worth fighting for, and these are not rights of ours today, because the rights are guaranteed mainly to those who have the most money. And in this case, it is those, the developers, the people who want to come in and flip a neighborhood. You know, and flipping means everybody in, get out of the way. We're bringing in a new set of people with more money, and that's what's going to happen. And we have seen that happen. So what I have to say to them is, not in our neighborhood, and I hope not in your neighborhood, are they going to get away with this.
We're starting to get questions from the audience. If you have questions, just get them to Kareem and he'll bring them up. So, question, what's stopping us from having rent control in Chicago?
I can take that, unless you want to go.
Well, I think that I think the contractors are stopping us from having rent control in Chicago because they're able to opt out. And opting out means that when they build their complexes, that they don't have to, they can pay not to build affordable housing. So I think that's one reason.
That's the in lieu fee that developers can pay so they don't have to build affordable housing in their developments.
Right, and it's cheaper for them, so.
I can answer it too. But obviously part of what's stopping us from having rent control is this ban in the first place, right? And for just a little bit of background on how that ban came to be, it was established in, I believe, the 1990s, where a national coalition of Republican state legislators decided to, in their collective states, push to pass laws that would preempt rent control before the effects of the housing crisis started to be felt in communities like this one. So now all of a sudden, all these folks need rent control, but we can't have it because this institutional barrier has been put in the way by developers and their allies in the state legislature. And right now, we are getting closer to getting that ban repealed as we have ever been, but it's slow because the same forces that created this problem in the first place are still there, right? So not only do we have these barriers and these people who are reluctant to remove these barriers, but at the end of the day, it's a crisis of imagination a little bit as well, right? Folks in this part of the city, in the country as a whole, haven't gotten together and started really thinking about, really considering rent control as even an option, because this has been one of many different kinds of ideas that have been forbidden to even talk about or think about for such a long time. And I think people are finally starting to wake up to that.
I agree with Mr. AK.
All right. So another question. What is the solution? What are some solutions for private owners, landlords? How are they supposed to survive considering the same issues we're talking about impacts them as well?
I know a little bit about this because I am a landlord. When my wife and I bought a place, it was a 3-flat, so we do have tenants. Landlords have a different financial interest in housing because they're getting income from it, as well as undoubtedly paying something for wherever they live. The important difference between the kinds of landlords that there are is that there are people who are part of the community, who own a building that's got more units than they need, and they've got their parents in, or they've got their friends in the unit, and they have some commitment to the community. So it's not just about making money for them. I mean, I'm not going to say that the landlords do not care about making money, because then I'd be lying. But there's people in the community who don't want to throw out their tenants. They want to be able to get what is considered by most to be a fair rent, and they want to have their community too. They don't want to see everybody forced out and moving away. So when we talk about a rent control law, we have to have provisions in it, which make it a little more complicated, that protect the small landlords so that they don't get run out and bankrupt or have to sell their house because they can't afford to fix it up, for example, or to do renovations after it's, the kitchens get old, everybody knows that. So they've got to be able to have an economic way to continue to function, where at the same time we block the big guys from coming in and taking over the neighborhood and changing it. That's what we want to avoid.
And I know, just to add, I know I've heard from landlords and developers that, part of why they actually support repealing the ban on rent control is because in the communities, right, oftentimes they're the small mom and pops, not the big fish, right? There's additional stressors that they're feeling, right? And so as property taxes increase because the property value increases, that puts them in a tough spot, right? Where they got to figure out, okay, how do I pay these increased property taxes? How do I pay these increased fees? And so what they've understood about the campaign is that if you regulate rent, it takes the incentive away from the big fish to come in and buy up communities and raise the rents up. That makes it unaffordable, not just for the renter, but the small landlord as well. And then there's the sort of hidden cost of having to renovate an apartment when somebody moves out. Hopefully they don't trash the place, right? But you got to go in, put some money in to get it ready for the next tenant. You got to pay money for your tenant screening, for listing the vacancy, et cetera. So if you have an affordable rent that the family can afford, they can become a long-term resident and hopefully build a relationship and help to stabilize your mortgage payments. So that's something else that I've also heard. Here's another question. Besides lifting the ban on rent control, are there other policy tools or steps that we could take to fight the rise of rent? An example they provide here are community benefit agreements or working with developers and private landlords.
Well, I think that we could work with developers and private landlords to teach them, to let them know that people, that lifting the ban on rent control would help them also, because they think that, some think that when you lift the ban on rent control, that it's draining the city. But that's not true because of a $1 million loan that the city gave to an organization for rent control, but the money was paid back. And so the money for Lift the Ban comes from the yearly rents that is collected during the months, during a 12-month stay in the housing.
So the cost for having a board that would oversee rent control would actually come from the rents that are collected
Right,
over
it's
the
a
year.
fund.
Okay.
Right.
All right. Are there other policy tools, suggestions, ideas for how to stop the rise in rent, or maybe not stop the rise in rent, but prevent it from rising so much?
I'm not sure exactly how that would deal with that specifically, but I definitely know that folks who live in Woodlawn or live in South Shore, they don't just want to be able to continue to be able to survive in these communities. They also want these communities to be invested in, right? So there's so much money that is flowing out of the bottom half of Chicago that is going to this central district into Ferris wheels and whatnot, that it needs to be invested in communities and hospitals. I feel that there's so much happening so that people don't lose the little that they have, that we forget to ask for more.
Okay. All right, someone who has a question about cooperative housing. So, co-ops, shared ownership initiatives. What can we do as co-ops, people who have joint ownership in a property, do to support housing, affordable housing?
Well, as I understand it, co-op housing is when several people go together and buy a multiple unit building or buildings together, and they manage them together. Excuse me. So there's no single owner. Excuse me. There's no single owner there. And if they put their money together, they can have enough money to make these down payments and make the purchases on a building that no single one of them could buy alone. So they avoid having a landlord, and they become co-owners with their other neighbors in their building. And like I say, I do know we have a co-op down the street from where I live that's been quite successful in maintaining their building, keeping the apartments rented, and keeping the building in good condition. So it's an alternative which we don't use much, and you kind of have to know somebody well enough to be willing to take that risk to go into that deal. I have friends who live in a 6-flat up in Logan Square, and they've made it work, and they're very happy with that, and their monthly payments are really quite small.
All right, thank you. Why do states with rent control, California, Washington, New York, et cetera, still have some of the highest rents in the U.S.? Why hasn't rent control helped in these states?
I'm not an expert, but there is definitely a bit of a bias here, right? Because if you take the parts of the country where there is the most dire need for rent control, and they establish rent control because the price of housing is too high, all the places with rent control are going to be the places that still have the highest rates of housing in the country, the highest prices of housing in the country. There are also a slew of other housing technicalities about how the law is enforced, what are the provisions of a specific rent control laws, and how that influences things like vacancy rates or the actual price of housing. But that does not mean that rent control as a concept, or if you take the proper provisions to make sure that the rules are enforced, does not work, because these places still have rent control and they haven't gotten rid of it yet. So,
Let's say the ban on rent control is lifted. What comes next? What do you think it should look like?
what was the question again?
Let's say the ban is lifted. What comes next? What do you think rent control should look like?
Rent control should look like. I mean, you're going to need the proper enforcement. You're going to need to engage with the communities that we built this for in the first place, right? So I know that depending on like what part of the country you look at, there are certain provisions that you need to put in place so that rent control does actually get to the communities that need it. I know there are issues with, like, if someone leaves the apartment and there's a vacancy, the landlord may or may not be allowed to jack the rents up by 1,000%, and that creates this perverse incentive for people to kick tenants out of their homes. So definitely things like that you're going to want to avoid, because it is relatively complicated, and there are all kinds of loopholes that the landlord lobby will exploit in other places that do have these laws to make an argument for why we shouldn't have rent control at all. But just because like your car has scratches doesn't mean that you shouldn't use vehicles. So that's, I don't know what to add to that.
Yeah, as the common saying is, the devil is in the details. And if you get rent control, you still have to work out all the details of how the regulations are written. How much can a landlord raise the rent? You know, one of the proposals that's out there and being discussed in Illinois is it should basically be tied to what's called the consumer price index, you know, of how much there's inflation every year, because every year our money gets worth a little less, and so for a landlord that means they would have to raise the rent a little bit to get the same value. And then there's the question of doing improvements, rehabbing a building, rehabbing an apartment, and how would the landlord get a fair return on fixing it up so it's a nicer apartment, while at the same time not pricing the possible tenants out of there by charging too much. So you have to write these into regulations, and usually rent control legislation includes some kind of a board, a rent control board made up of citizens representing various interests like landowners and tenants and community activists that have to judge on conflicts or disagreements between the tenant and the landlord over prices or so forth, or evictions. So there's a lot of detail that has to be written into a good rent control ordinance or law for it to work right. And you can be sure that the large land developers will be looking to sneak in their little language that you don't see it until you get to court and some judge says, oh yeah, this says that. And so you do have to be very careful and have skilled people helping you write those kind of regulations.
I think, yep, go ahead.
What was the question again?
Let's say the ban is lifted. What comes next? What do you think rent control should look like?
Well, I think it should look like the ARO can live up to its name, Affordable Rent Ordinance, right?
Requirements ordinance. Okay. All right, so I think just a point that's come up a couple of times clarifies a common misperception. With rent control, rent still is increased, right? Property owners still are able to cover their cost of doing business and still make a profit. The difference is that there's some limit placed on how much profit can be earned, right? Oregon is probably one of the most recent places where a statewide rent control policy was adopted. I think their percentage is around 10%, something like that. So the property owner can increase rent no more than 10% from one year to the next. But again, as Bill talked about in terms of the rent control board, if they want to go above that, they have to apply to the board and have a good reason as to why they need to go above that 10%. So appreciate you drawing that distinction out there. Are there other questions that people have? I have a question. So just going off this last one here, because I think it's sort of provocative the way it's worded. The ban gets lifted, rent control comes to Chicago, comes to Aurora. What happens then in terms of development? Does that mean that development will stop because people can't make as much money as they want to anymore? Play this out for us.
Go ahead and start. First of all, the ban getting lifted is one part. Getting Chicago to actually implement rent control is a whole other battle that we have yet to have. As far as people are going to stop building houses because they can't jack up rent, that's most likely not the case, considering that California, Oregon, New York City, parts of Massachusetts, these are all still parts of the country that exist and continue to have houses. People are still building very, very many, very large, very expensive buildings in New York, and rent control has not stopped them. So more often than not, this is framed as a doomsday scenario that never comes, just because the individuals who would benefit from being able to gentrify neighborhoods are the same ones who would rather make this much more in profit than this much in profit. In either case, there's still very vibrant communities, I believe, in California and Oregon and New York, and they all have houses.
Yes, hopeful interpretation. We have to, we're somewhat at the mercy of these guys with their big money and how they decide to spend it. And they've got more than one option. It's not just we're going to build housing. You know, they can invest in lots of different other things when they have that kind of money. So again, it depends a lot on how the law is written. Is in the case of us, are we going to have neighborhood by neighborhood rent control, or is the entire city going to have rent control? Are we going to identify certain neighborhoods that need rent control and other neighborhoods where the lid is off and they can charge what they want? That would make a difference. But even in a neighborhood like Little Village, for example, if we did have rent control, a developer could still buy up land, could still turn a vacant lot into a 3-flat. That would be possible. And again, how are the regulations going to be written? But in that neighborhood, there's demand for housing. If somebody built affordable housing in our neighborhood, there would be people there wanting to move in. So if you can convince the developers that that's in their interest to develop in that sort of way, then you can see development in these communities that need rent control too. They don't have to take their money and run away. They have to make some decisions though, and we have to figure out how to work with them because at least at this stage in the game, they got the money.
All right. Well, it looks like we have one last question, and looks like there still may be some additional questions left out there. Hopefully, we've answered a ton of them for you, and if you have more, I'm sure you can get the contact information for any of these fine people up here, and they'll answer those questions for you. So, is there a way that my household can approach the state legislature to let our representatives know that we support House Bill 255? What actions can I take? And House Bill 255 is current legislation in Springfield that would repeal the ban on rent control. So is there a way that my household can approach the state legislature to let our representatives know that we support House Bill 255? What actions can I take? Excellent question to end on.
Well, you can call your legislators. You can write to them. You can organize as a group and go on social media and have some of your friends do the same. You know, because the more people that push for this legislation, the more likely it is about to happen. So.
A lot of elected officials have community meetings where they essentially invite their constituents in to say something to them, what their concerns are. If you see those advertised, that's a good place to go to bring that up, and you'll often find other people there who agree with you. You won't be alone to speak out. I hope we've got your contact information because you showed up here today, because there'll be organized trips to go to Springfield when the time is right to put pressure on the senators and the legislators to vote right. Definitely there is power in numbers at a time like that. So every person turning out and having their say makes a big difference when the push is on in Springfield, because we got to be pushing with numbers and people who vote as a counterweight to the people who only have a few votes but have a lot of money that they can use to contribute to these different candidates, and that's their bargaining chip. So we got to have, you got to be a chip. Me too.
And I want to point out Rod Wilson, Executive Director with the Eugenia Burns Hope Center and Legislative Coordinator for the Lift the Ban Coalition, is in the audience. So if people want to figure out how to get to your legislator, that's the guy to talk to. Mr. Wilson, want to shoot your hand up? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a member of Access Living, and I advocate with the organization that's called DRAC. Well, it's a Disability Rights Action Coalition for Housing, and we talk to our legislators. We go to Springfield, we go to Washington, and we get some legislation passed. Now, do they agree on everything that we ask for? No, they don't. So, you know, sometimes it has to be pushed, and it works that way, and sometimes it just doesn't. So sometimes we just lay things to the side. You know, we don't throw anything away completely, and we just wait until the time comes for us to push this legislation, and we go back forward. So it can be done.
And it can be done with your help. So help me give the panel a round of applause, please. Thank all of you for being here. And again, if you have questions, you can, I'm assuming you all will hang around for a second. You can approach the panel if you'd like to talk to Mr. Wilson. He's here as well. Thanks, everybody.